The deep dive is where we take the sources you share with us and distill them into the nuggets of insight you need to know. Today, we are deep diving into Charlie Chaplin, but, we're intentionally leaving the beloved little tramp behind. We're focusing on the fierce political activist he became and the incredible price he paid for finally choosing to speak.
That's exactly right. This is all about Chaplin's massive pivot from a silent universal comedian to a really controversial, outspoken public critic. We're going to zero in on his two defining talking films, The Great Dictator from 1940 and Monsieur Verdoux from 1947, and we'll track the Cold War persecution that turned an American icon into, well, an exile. We'll be analyzing exactly how he crafted his political message and why it was so effective and so dangerous to the establishment.
So our mission today is to move beyond that simple narrative of a genius comic. We want to understand how Chaplin consciously leveraged his enormous global platform for some really high-stakes political critique. We want to know not just what he said, but what tools he used to make his rhetoric stick and, why the reaction ultimately drove him away from the country he'd called home for 40 years. Before he fully embraced dialogue, Chaplin was already sort of testing the limits of political satire in silence. We have to note that his 1936 film, Modern Times, was the final, mostly silent outing for the Tramp, and it was just a direct hit on industrialization, the tyranny of the machine during the Great Depression.
Oh, absolutely. That film really critiques a system where, the pursuit of factory efficiency and profit literally swallowed the lives of ordinary people. You see Chaplin's character getting caught in the gears, physically embodying that dehumanizing aspect of modern industry. And even that early, pretty gentle critique was enough for certain groups to accuse him of producing communistic propaganda.
Just for advocating for human dignity over unfettered capitalism. But the real moment of rupture, when he trades his universal silence for a polarizing voice, that happens 4 years later with The Great Dictator in 1940. This was his first full talking picture, and he only did it because he had a message so urgent it needed to be heard, verbally.
And he plays two roles, of course. The humble Jewish barber and the ruthless dictator Adonai Hinkel, a very transparent satire of Hitler. The whole movie is farcical parody and slapstick comedy right up until the final 5 minutes.
And that's when everything changes.
Everything changes. The Jewish barber, mistaken for Hinkel, steps forward, looks right at the audience, and delivers this absolutely impassioned 5-minute plea for peace, democracy, and fundamental humanism.
It is a moment of pure shock. I mean, the entire structure of cinematic storytelling is just shattered. You go from a farcical comedy to a serious political soapbox. What's truly audacious is that he's interrupting his own movie to deliver this global call to action.
It was an incredible act of artistic courage, especially given the geopolitical climate. At that time, before the U.S. entered World War II, there were a lot of pressures against making negative portrayals of foreign leaders. Chaplin knew the risk. And while the film was initially his biggest commercial success, that overt political preaching, fusing his star persona permanently with politics, that's what triggered the eventual decline in his popularity.
And the beginning of the end for the Tramp image.
Mm-hmm.
So if the moment was revolutionary, how did Chaplin ensure the message landed so effectively? Because millions of people around the world heard this speech and were genuinely moved. You can't just, stumble into that kind of rhetorical power.
It's true. When you analyze the speech's structure, what linguists call critical discourse analysis, you realize how carefully constructed it was. At the micro level, Chaplin used incredibly simple, direct vocabulary and grammar. He wasn't trying to sound philosophical or elite. He was trying to sound universally human. That simplicity created a stark moral binary. Good versus evil. Tyranny versus basic humanity.
And what's interesting is how the grammar itself changes to reflect a rising urgency. He starts by describing the problem statements of fact, like saying, greed has poisoned men's souls. That's the declarative mood.
Right. But then he abruptly shifts to the imperative mood.
Demanding action.
Yes, he shifts from stating facts to demanding action. He moves from being a witness to becoming a leader, saying things like, let us fight to free the world.
Yeah.
That grammatical shift signals that the speaker now assumes authority, moving the audience from passive listeners to participants in the struggle.
He also uses a tremendous amount of repetition hammering home words like machine, men, and power. It just makes the speech instantly memorable and reinforces the idea of resistance.
And that ties into a concept that the analysis calls a polyphony of voices. It means that when you listen to the speech, you aren't hearing just one person.
Wait, how can a humble Jewish barber suddenly command the rhetorical authority of a global leader? Isn't that a massive contradiction?
Well, that's the brilliance of it, the polyphony. You hear three voices simultaneously. The first is the Jewish barber, the little man who understands real everyday problems. The second is the seasoned orator, who is strategically using rhetoric to master global problems. And the third, the most powerful, is Chaplin the filmmaker himself, utilizing his unparalleled international persona to break the fourth wall and speak directly to millions of fans.
So by blending those three layers, he gives the message humility, intelligence, and celebrity power all at once.
Absolutely. The function of the speech, socially, is what we call counter-discourse. Simply put, he is deliberately talking back to the establishment. He's actively rejecting the dominant fascist narrative of the time and establishing an alternative framework of truth, one based on universal humanism. He's trying to discursively shift power back from the dictators to the common people.
And if you look at the entire film through the lens of subversion, the fact that the lowest man, the Jewish barber, ends up being mistaken for the world's most powerful tyrant is fundamentally anarchic.
It is. It embodies what literary theory calls carnivalesque logic, which means using comedy and role reversal, swapping the lowest class with the highest, to temporarily overturn and mock a fixed, fear-based totalitarian order.
The Great Dictator was a clear, if controversial, anti-fascist statement. But by the time Chaplin made his next major talking film 7 years later, the critique deepened and turned shockingly dark.
Yeah, we moved to Monsieur Verdoux in 1947. This film represents a complete break. The protagonist, Henri Verdoux, bears absolutely no resemblance to the Tramp. He is a seemingly respectable, middle-aged man.
Verdoux is a former bank teller who was laid off during the stock market crash. And to support his family, he develops this highly logical professional scheme. He marries and murders wealthy widows for their assets. He views his serial killing not as a moral crime, but purely as a business transaction.
And that is the crux of the film's controversial political message. Chaplin is using this character to argue that the difference between the actions of a single criminal and the actions of industry, banking, and military leaders is purely one of scale.
This film gives us one of the darkest, most cynical, and most famous lines in cinema. Verdoux, awaiting execution, confronts a reporter with this: "One murder makes a villain, millions a hero. Numbers sanctify."
Wow. That line is a direct, scathing indictment of societal hypocrisy and the logic of capitalism taken to its extreme. The film was released right after World War II, when the world was reeling from global bloodshed and contemplating the atomic bomb. Chaplin intended the film to be an implicit atomic protest and a critique of war profiteering.
But the American public and the critics, they were absolutely not ready for this. The comic genius they loved was gone, replaced by a philosophical murderer condemning their entire economic system.
The reaction was immediate and hostile. Verdoux was boycotted by major civic groups in the U.S., and it failed commercially. It was too cynical, too dark, and too explicitly anti-capitalist for the immediate post-war mood. Even though it was later recognized critically, this film cemented the idea in the minds of his detractors that Chaplin was not just a comic, but a truly subversive political figure.
It seems like that combination, the passionate anti-fascist plea in The Great Dictator, followed by the nihilistic anti-capitalist critique of Verdoux, gave Chaplin's opponents all the material they needed, especially once the Cold War started heating up. Hoover and the FBI were watching him for decades, weren't they?
They were. J. Edgar Hoover first took an interest in Chaplin way back in 1922, but the majority of the FBI file detailing subversive activity concentrates on the post-1942 period. They launched an exhaustive effort to connect him to communist front groups and radical movements. Our sources show the FBI explicitly interpreted the powerful ending of The Great Dictator as subtle communist propaganda.
It's shocking to think about someone of his fame being tracked for 3 decades. And the strategy they used to discredit him was highly effective, wasn't it? It was a 3-pronged attack designed to undermine his character completely.
That's how they successfully constructed his subversive image. They conflated 3 distinct lines of attack into one easy target. The first prong was his political leanings, his leftist views, and his associations with figures like the composer Hans Eisler, and groups dedicated to anti-fascist causes.
Okay, and the second was pure character assassination, his alleged moral depravity. They rehashed every lurid scandal and legal trouble he had ever faced, most damagingly the Joan Barry paternity suit, painting him as a moral danger to the country.
And the final critical prong was his alien status. He had lived in the U.S. for 40 years, was a massive American cultural figure, but had consistently refused to become a citizen. This refusal was ammunition.
He had a philosophical reason for that refusal, though, right? He saw himself as something greater than a national figure.
Exactly. Chaplin stated publicly that he considered himself a citizen of the world, an internationalist, and a patriot to humanity as a whole. He was arguing for a global human bond over nationalism, but in the context of the Red Scare, this high-minded philosophical position was deliberately twisted by his adversaries to portray him as disloyal and dangerous.
And the final dramatic act came in 1952.
It was almost theatrical in its timing. In September 1952, Chaplin and his family sailed from New York to Europe to promote his new film, Limelight. While he was literally crossing the Atlantic, Attorney General James McGranary, after intensive consultation with Hoover, revoked Chaplin's reentry permit.
So he was denied the ability to return home, citing grave moral charges and communist allegations.
After decades of intense scrutiny, harassment, and an effective campaign to destroy his reputation, Chaplin, now in Europe, made the choice not to fight the revocation. He elected never to return to the United States. He settled in Switzerland and, crucially, continued his critique. His 1957 film, A King in New York, was a clear, retaliatory satire against the Red Scare itself, a film he banned from release in the U.S. until 1973.
So we really see the full trajectory. Chaplin exchanged the silence and universal acceptance of the Tramp persona for the polarizing, often dangerous power of his political voice. He used film as a potent form of social action against fascism, industrialization, and hypocritical capitalism. And he paid the ultimate price of exile for his willingness to speak.
And despite that persecution and the initial failures of his spoken works like Monsieur Verdoux, his political critiques today are seen as highly prescient, addressing fundamental concepts like democracy, humanity, and unity. His deliberate decision to break character and shatter cinematic conventions cemented him not just as a genius comedian, but as a master of critical discourse who shaped power through persuasion.
So here's a provocative thought for you to consider. Chaplin was hounded out of the U.S. during the height of the Cold War for promoting a radical humanism that questioned dominant ideologies. Yet his final impassioned speech in The Great Dictator contains a line that remains universally quoted as a simple truth. We think too much and feel too little. What kind of critical thinking or what kind of essential feeling does that line inspire in you today?